2018 has got off to a bit of a slow start with the layout. I've been very busy at work over the last 2 months getting a car completed for a customer, and I've also been going in on Saturdays trying to get the metalwork finished on my own restoration project, so I haven't had a great deal of time available to work on the layout recently. As you can see, I've made a reasonable bit of progress despite the work commitments. This is a hobby at the end of the day, and I don't have too much time available for it sometimes, so the videos will go up as and when I make progress. I do not have a fixed upload schedule, and I do not do YouTube for a living, so you're going to have to just live with updates coming as and when I get the work done on the layout. That said, a milestone has been completed, and that is that the track level now goes all the way around the room. So all that's left is to lay the track, and I will have a circuit. I have actually started laying the track. I've only made a little bit of progress, but the first bit of track has now been laid. So it won't be too long now, hopefully, before a train runs around here for the first time. So now would probably be a good time to talk about the track plan. It's taken me probably a year to complete the sort of track plan in my head. I have used a bit of software here and there to help me plan it, but most of it has been planned in my head. I tend to find that seems to work for me. I've tailored the track plan towards what I like to do with a model railway. It might not necessarily be your cup of tea, but it's what I want to do with this layout, and I've also used the experience I've gained in the previous layout to influence the track plan for this one. What I learned on the old layout was that for me personally, having lots of sidings and yards and depots and sort of storage for the trains on the scenic side, I didn't really use. I tended to find that I enjoyed watching the trains run around the route rather than shunting in the sidings. So with that in mind, I have reduced the depots and sidings on this layout to almost nothing. A side effect of that is it should hopefully make this layout look quite a bit more realistic. Something I noticed on the old layout was that every time you put a siding in, you made the place look more cluttered and perhaps more unrealistic. Hopefully this will be a little bit more convincing. Over on this side of the layout, I'm going to be building the station. That's why the deck is quite wide. The station will have 5 platforms, so that's 2 platforms for the main lines, 2 platforms for the relief lines, and 1 bay platform to provide some interest in operation and some diversity with the scenery. You'll notice as well that this is not perfectly straight. It has a slight curve to it. I've tried to avoid running dead straight track anywhere on the layout to again create that more realistic appearance. You'll find, particularly in Britain, many of our railway lines are not perfectly straight. They're always curving one way or the other, even if it's very slightly over a distance of miles. Dead straight track in Britain is, for the most part, unusual. So the station has a slight sweep to it, which leads into the first of the 2 large bends on the layout. All of the lines on the station will leave in this direction and will run parallel to each other, including the branch that runs into the bay platform, and they will then go around this corner. The radius of the corner is not fixed. It starts off gently, as per the real thing. It then tightens as we get towards the middle of the turn, and then as the train will exit the corner, it will smooth out, just like the real railway. So we start off gently, then tighten, and then smoothen out. I've done my best using the space I have available to make this curve as smooth as possible. I didn't want any tight turns at all on the layout if I could avoid it. It's still a relatively tight corner by real life sort of scale standards, but certainly in model form it looks very nice and gentle and should provide that illusion of a high speed main line. On the exit to the station I'm going to be having 1 siding. It'll be between the main and relief lines, and I'll be using it for parking a DMU in if the service needs to reverse and run back the way it came from. You'll find reversing sidings throughout the British network in various stations. You'll also notice I am providing some super elevation in the curves. That is to give the curves a banking to them, just like the real thing. I'll cover that in more detail on the track laying video, which will hopefully be following in a few weeks. At the exit of the main curve you can see the branch line is starting to descend. I've done that on a 1 in 50 gradient, which is relatively steep by British Rail standards, but is certainly not the steepest in existence on the British network, not by a long way. So that is perfectly negotiable by most types of train, and as it's a branch line it'll only be running multiple units of 2 or 3 cars in length, so the 1 in 50 gradient is justified, I think. Over here on the left hand side will all be scenery. This is where I'm trying to make the layout look as realistic as possible by just not having yards and track going all over the place. I want it to try and sort of look as much like an entrance into a built-up area, say, you know, coming from countryside into a major station. I don't want yards and depots and stuff all over the place. Although that does exist in places in real life, I do not have the space to do it justice or make it look convincing. So if everything goes to plan, it should look real nice and realistic. The trains will just basically run through the scenery, which is ultimately what I want to do. On the old layout, I didn't really use any of the sidings or yards. I parked trains in them, but rarely did shunting. I enjoyed watching the trains go around, so that's the plan with this layout. So as the branch line begins to descend, we enter the second of the large corners on the layout. Branch line is slightly tighter, coming further away from the main lines, and the 1 in 50 gradient is making sure it descends quite nicely below the main running lines. As with the previous curve, this curve starts off gently and then gradually tightens as it gets towards the middle of the curve before sort of becoming more relaxed and straightening out again to give that nice sort of smooth transition. I've also made sure that the section that connects the two curves together is not straight and does not run parallel to the back scene, although it may appear it's running parallel in the picture you can see. Note how the grass on the back scene is visible here and it is not visible over there. That shows the back scene is dynamically moving towards and away from the track as the layout moves around the room. As we come around the curve you can see the back scene is moving even further away. Should provide a nice bit of scenic interest to the layout and make things look a bit more real. I didn't want to have any sort of forced symmetry anywhere on the layout, as it's rarely seen in the real world. Once we exit the curve, you can see the branch line is now at the correct depth to diverge and run underneath the main running lines. I've done that again for scenic interest. That'll have a lovely bridge and then the surrounding scenery should complement things really well. I've got a slight alteration in the deck here where I hope to have a very small station halt, or perhaps even a disused station. Due to its proximity to the main station on the other side, it's quite possible it be disused by the 1980s. But again, another nice little bit of interest without adding lots of track. You can also see the main lines are, again, they're not running straight, even though we are arguably on a straight part of the layout. They're taking a very gradual S-bend over towards the fiddle yard. And again, if you can imagine a train coming in this direction, it should look really nice as the camera follows it along its route. Another reason for not cramming loads of track in is from where you're sitting, this probably looks very large, and indeed by model railway standards, certainly in Britain, this would be considered a large layout. But if you actually scale all this up to the real world, all of this scenic area is less than a mile long. So filling it full of yards and factories and exchange sidings and depots and having a main line and having a branch line just doesn't really work. You can't justify it. You haven't got enough room. So I really hope this is going to work, that it's just going to look realistic. With regards to the scenery, most of the scenery in the foreground is going to be dropped down, so with any luck what we'll be able to do is perhaps look across a road at some houses and then see the trains running behind on the elevated section in the background. I want the scenery to take the main pride of place on the layout, so this will probably be a sort of suburb area as we sort of get into the town. The station area obviously will be considerably more built up, and then as we work our way around the layout in this direction, it will get more and more scenic from a countryside perspective, with mostly things being green and covered in trees. So that's the basic track plan. It's not to everybody's taste, I understand, but this is my layout and I want to make sure I plan the track how I want to plan the track, not how people think I should do it. I've deliberately kept it very simple, and I'm really chasing that idea of trains rushing through the countryside or the town as people make their journeys to the station. I don't want yards and depots and locomotives sitting all over the place. That certainly has its place on a model railway, but I do not have the space to justify it, in my opinion. As you can see, the deck has been constructed using the L girder technique. I've gone for T-shaped girders, so you can do any shape you like as long as it holds the top boards up. So the top is 9mm birch ply. I've given it a lick of paint as it's unlikely it's going to have ballast on it anytime soon, so a lick of paint just makes it look a little bit more convincing, I suppose, just gives me something to look at other than bare wood. So 9mm on the top, and then I've just used the same 12mm exterior grade ply for the girders, and they seem to be doing a grand job of holding everything up. This has been assembled for nearly 2 months now, and no issues whatsoever. When you follow it around with your eye, everything is lovely and level. It is simple to construct, it's not particularly difficult, however it is time consuming, and you need to obviously have a good idea of your track plan and where the track is going to go. This has all been planned in my head, but I've had this idea of what I want the layout to do for a long time now, so for me working out where all the plywood was going to go wasn't too difficult. So we'll go back in time a bit now, and I'll show you how I constructed the deck specifically for the branch line. Exactly the same principle for the main lines, it's just on a slightly larger scale. As the branch is only a single line, it has to bear very little weight, so the girders are quite small. They're just simple vertical bands of plywood, as you can see here. They're about 1.5 inches wide. Okay, I've got myself an offcut of plywood to continue the branch, and as you can see by the doubling up here of the plywood frames, this means that this is where two tables join each other, so I need to make sure that this is cut so that these tables could be pulled apart if needed. Fortunately, I've cut this piece to do another bit, and the curve that's here is not bad. It's pretty nice and smooth, and it leads off nicely from the previous bit. So what I will do is put some marks along, replicate the curve on the other side, cut it out, clean up the edges a little bit, and then I'll build the girders, and obviously I need to cut it along there as well. So it's just a short section just to finish off the branch line on this section of the table. Okay, I'm going to mark on the points for the gradient. I'm dropping 4mm every 200mm to replicate 1 in 50, and you can see my last mark is there. So again, using the flexible bit of wood that I've been using as a guide for getting the curves, I've also marked on it every 200mm, as you can see there. So if we line it up, it hasn't got to be super accurate, but just a mark every 200. And now I've got something to measure from, so I know that the gradient is correct as I set things up. The number on the marks represents in millimetres the distance between the top of the timber and the top of the lower baseboard frame, and then each 200mm it drops by 4. Okay, that's the next bit in. That's basically how you do it. It's relatively simple, it just takes a little while. It's quite rewarding as you slowly build your way to joining up the circuit. But yeah, it's looking good. To check that it's all flowing properly and you haven't got any nasty little bumps or anything, the absolute best thing you can do is just get down low as if you were watching the layout when it's complete and really look along the route of the line looking for any nasty undulations or bumps. It's going to be difficult for you to see anything on camera, but trust me, to the naked eye, if something's wrong, you will spot it. If you don't want to get involved in working out your gradients, you can just buy ready-made gradients in a flexible foam. There's various gradients available. You simply plonk them down on a flat tabletop and you have a gradient nice and smoothly already done for you. I can't do that because I have open frame baseboards, so regardless of whatever I did, I was going to have to build a deck, whether that was to support the track or to support a foam gradient that goes over the top of it. So as I was building a deck, I thought, well, I might as well just do the gradient as part of the deck, and it just seemed to make more sense. And it's been quite enjoyable making the gradient exactly what I want. Now this small section is done. I'm going to just give the edges a bit of a clean up, a little bit of sanding, and then I will give them a lick of paint, and then I'll move on to doing the last push towards the fiddle yard. This line on this piece of timber represents the bottom of the mainline deck as it passes over the branch line, and as you can see, the 150 gradient has allowed me to get low enough, and there is now more than sufficient clearance to get a coach or a DMU through there. Okay, with the deck complete and the paint now dry, I can start thinking about laying some track. So before I get onto it, I will just talk to you a little bit about the track I'm going to be using. The local wildlife already seems to be making use of the deck. Seems to be quite a nice, easy way to get around the room. The layout will feature two different types of rail. On the left is bullhead rail, which has been recently introduced into the ready-to-run range by Pico, and on the right is familiar flat-bottom rail that has been in the hobby for many years. Bullhead rail was the traditional rail chosen for use on railways, and particularly if you are modelling steam from the 1950s or backwards, most of the track that you need on your layout should be of bullhead type. As time progressed, technology moved on and flat bottom rail was gradually introduced, and now pretty much everywhere is flat bottom rail, but you can still find bullhead if you know where to look, particularly in sidings and lightly used station platforms. The layout is set during the late 1980s, so I can use bullhead rail in a number of locations, as many branches were still using that type of rail at that time. As a close-up of the bullhead rail, and you can see the general shape and appearance of the rail, and you can also see the method that is used to secure it to the sleepers. By contrast, flat bottom rail looks quite different. The bottom of the rail is flat and considerably wider, and the method used to hold it to the sleepers is different. So particularly when used in varying amounts, Pico bullhead and Pico flat bottom rail looks quite good together because you've got various different types of track on the same layout. I'll be using the bullhead particularly in sidings, and I may even use it for the entirety of the branch line. The bullhead track has been recently introduced by Pico and is aimed at the more serious 00 scale modeller. So you will notice that the sleepers appear further apart than they do on the standard Pico Streamline range flat bottom rail track. The reason for the increased gap between the sleepers is because this track here, that we have been used to for many years, has its sleepers too close together for 00 scale. 00 scale is a compromise because the locomotives, although 1/76 scale, 00 scale, they are running on HO scale track. So this is HO scale track and the sleepers are spaced accordingly as per HO scale. To try and improve the look and realism of the ready-to-run track, what Pico have done is they have increased the gaps between the sleepers on this new range of track to a more prototypical spacing, more accurate for 00 scale. Now you still have the problem of this track being HO scale, meaning that these two rails are theoretically too close together, but as all British models in 00 scale have to run on this without modification, then that's what you have to deal with. So this is basically a happy compromise with what you can get off the shelf. If you want to run your 00 scale models on true scale track, then you need to basically go down the route of kit building and build your own scale track. I'm not prepared to do that yet, although I may do it one day in the future. So what I've opted to do this time round is opt for a happy compromise using the off-the-shelf items from Pico, that is using the new bullhead track, which is a nice addition to the range and I'd like to try and use some of it, and then to make the traditional flat bottom rail look a bit more prototypical, I will increase the spacing on the sleepers so it matches this bullhead rail here, and then both sections of rail will look basically the same or similar because they will have the same spacing, and the visual difference will be on the type of rail. So the majority of the layout will be laid using this stuff with the respace sleepers. This is the concrete style sleepers, which were very common from the 1970s onwards. Most high speed or highly used lines had moved away from wooden sleeper construction and were now using concrete. There's a piece of just ordinary streamlined Code 100 track in the middle, which is the stuff I've used on the fiddle yard. You can see the appearance of the rail is much chunkier, the rail is much taller, and it is not quite to scale, or not as scale looking, let's say. The Code 75, as you can see, has a much lower profile and it just looks that little bit finer. Now it's a small difference in isolation, but when you add that to your entire layout you can make quite a big visual impact just by being careful with the selection of your track. As I'm using Code 100 in the fiddle yard, as I used all the old track from the previous layout, I will need to use these Pico transition pieces which make the transfer from Code 100 to Code 75, and again the difference in the type of rail is evident. The Code 75 being not as tall and having a generally finer appearance. So there you go, that concludes the update. I hope you enjoyed the video. I am still here and I am still working on the layout, but it is a hobby. It is not my job to build this layout. It is purely a hobby and I do not always have the time to do it. So the videos, as always, will be available as and when I make progress. But hopefully over the next coming months I should be able to speed things up a little bit. I know you're all anxious to see the trains run. I'm anxious to see the trains run as well, but I'm not going to rush. I want to take my time. I want to get this right. So the closest you'll get to trains running at the moment is just this, I'm afraid. But even that is strangely satisfying, and hopefully in the next few months there'll be a locomotive on the end of those coaches. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked what you saw, you can see more Everard Junction videos by clicking on the left. You can click on the right and check out Dean Park Station, another excellent model railway set in Scotland in the 1980s.